In the fair realm of Dol Amroth, where the white towers gleamed like pearls beneath the southern sun, there dwelt a maiden whose beauty was spoken of in whispers from Minas Tirith to the havens of Umbar. Morwen the Starlit, she was called, daughter of Prince Imrahil's cousin, and her eyes held the light of Arundel's star. Yet beneath her fair countenance lay a spirit wild and untamed, drawn ever to the ancient lore and forbidden knowledge that dwelt in the deep vaults of the Swan Knight's library. The year was 3018 of the Third Age, and shadow was stirring once more in the east. Yet Morwen paid little heed to the dark rumors that reached even the blessed shores of Belfalas. Her days were spent in study of the elder days, poring over scrolls that spoke of the rings of power and the dark servants of the shadow. The learned men of her house warned her that such knowledge was perilous for one so young and fair, yet she would not be turned from her purpose. "There is power in understanding one's enemy," she would say, her gray eyes flashing with determination. "The greatest victories are won not by sword alone, but by wisdom that pierces the darkness." It was in the deepest vault of the Tower of the Seaward that she first found the ancient tome bound in black leather, its pages written in the fair script of Numenor, but telling of things that should not be. Within its yellowed leaves lay the secret histories of the Nine, who had once been kings of men, ere they fell under the dominion of the Dark Lord. And there, in faded ink that seemed to writhe beneath her gaze, she read of Khamûl, the Easterling, second in might among the Nazgûl, and the tragic tale of his mortal day. Long into the night she read, until the candles burned low and the sea wind rattled the casements. And when at last she closed the accursed book, her heart was heavy with a strange sorrow, for she had glimpsed the man that Khamûl had once been, noble and proud, yet undone by the promise of endless days and the whisper of power beyond mortal ken. "Even the shadow was once light," she whispered to the darkness, not knowing that her words would echo through fate itself. As dawn broke over the white city, Prince Imrahil himself came to the tower, his face grave with tidings from the north. "Fair cousin," he said, though the words sat heavy on his tongue, "I fear the time of peace draws to its close. Riders have come from Minas Tirith, with summons for all who would stand against the darkness. War is upon us." But Morwen's thoughts were far from war, lost still in the tragedy of the Nine and the weight of knowledge newly gained. The great host of Gondor marched forth under banners of white and silver, and with them rode the Swan Knights of Dol Amroth in their bright hauberk. Yet Morwen did not ride with the warriors, though her heart burned to join them. Prince Imrahil had forbidden it, naming her too precious to risk in the coming storm. Instead, she was commanded to remain with the healers and wise women who would tend the wounded in the aftermath of battle. Yet fate, it seemed, had other plans for the Maid of Dol Amroth. On the third night of their march toward Minas Tirith, as the host lay encamped beneath the shadow of the arid Nimrais, a fell wind arose from the east. With it came a darkness that was more than absence of light, a shadow that crept into the hearts of men and whispered of despair. The horses screamed and reared, and even the bravest knights felt their courage falter. "The Nazgûl ride," whispered the guards, and men made such signs of protection as they knew. But Morwen felt no fear, only a strange pulling in her heart, as though some invisible thread drew her toward the source of the shadow. While others huddled around their fires and spoke prayers to ward off evil, she rose from her bed and walked to the edge of the camp, drawn by a compulsion she could not name. There, at the border of light and darkness, she saw him. The Nazgûl sat upon his fell steed, motionless as a statue carved from night itself. No feature could be seen beneath the black hood, yet she knew him by some instinct deeper than sight. This was Khamûl the Easterling, he whose mortal story she had read by candlelight in the Tower of the Seaward. The terrible irony was not lost upon her, that she should meet in flesh the one whose tragedy had moved her to such pity. For long moments they regarded each other across the space between light and shadow, and strange to say, the Nazgûl made no move to advance or to flee. It seemed to her that even the fell beast beneath him stood strangely still, as though time itself had paused in recognition of this fateful meeting. Then, moved by impulse or madness, Morwen stepped forward into the darkness. "I know you," she said, and her voice carried clearly in the still air. "Not the shadow you have become, but the man you once were, Hamul of the East, who loved his people and sought only to preserve their glory against the dying of the light." A sound escaped the hooded figure. Whether gasp or hiss, she could not tell. The fell beast shifted uneasily, but still the Nazgûl did not move to strike. "What would you know of what I was?" The voice came hollow and cold, as winter wind through empty halls. "I am become deathless night, servant of the Dark Lord. The man you speak of is dust and memory. Yet you remember," Morwen said, stepping closer still. "Else you would have struck me down ere I spoke his name. The chain that binds you is not of adamant. It is forged of despair and lies. You were deceived, great lord, deceived into trading your nobility for a shadow of life." The Nazgûl raised one gauntleted hand, and she saw the ring gleaming upon his finger, one of the 9 instruments of his enslavement. Yet still he did not strike. "Pretty words," he said, though there was something almost like longing in a terrible voice. "Yet what would you have me do? The choice was made long ages past. I am bound until the world's end. Choices can be unmade," Morwen replied, though she knew not what power gave her such boldness. Even the mightiest chains must have a key. And then, before courage could fail her, or wisdom counsel restraint, she reached up and touched the cold metal of his gauntleted hand. The Nazgûl recoiled as though burned, and the fell beast beneath him reared and screamed. Yet in that instant of contact, something passed between them. A spark of warmth in the endless cold, a glimpse of sunlight through the eternal night. "Impossible," the ring-wraith whispered, and there was wonder in his voice, and pain, and something that might once have been hope. The host of Gondor pressed onward toward Minas Tirith, yet Morwen's thoughts remained fixed upon her strange encounter in the darkness. By day she rode with the healers and wise women, speaking little and keeping her own counsel, but each night, when the company made camp, she found herself watching the eastern sky, wondering if the shadow would come again. Prince Imrahil marked her strange mood and sought to question her, but she turned aside his concerns with gentle words and false smiles. How could she speak of what had passed between herself and the ringwraith? Who would believe that one of the 9 had stayed his hand at her words, or that she had seen beneath the shadow something that might yet be redeemed? Yet the encounter had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The ancient lore she had studied now seemed to burn within her mind with new urgency. In quiet moments, she found herself recalling every word written about the forging of the rings of power, every hint and fragment that might speak to the nature of the Nazgûl's bondage. On the 5th night of their journey, as they camped within sight of the great city's walls, she made her decision. When the watch had been set and the camp settled into uneasy sleep, she rose from her bedroll and slipped away into the darkness. Behind her, she left only a letter for Prince Imrahil, begging his forgiveness and his understanding. "Dear cousin," she had written, "I go now upon a path that I alone must walk. Do not seek to follow me, for this burden is mine to bear. I have seen something in the darkness that others cannot see, a glimmer of light that might yet be kindled to flame. Whether I succeed or fail, know that I act not from folly, but from the deepest wisdom of my heart." She rode through the night on a swift mare she had taken from the horse lines, her path leading not toward the safety of the city, but into the wild lands of Ithilien. For she had remembered something from her reading, a fragment from the elder days that spoke of a place where the power of the rings might be tested and perhaps challenged. The ancient Númenóreans had built a shrine there, in a hidden valley where the waters ran pure and untainted by shadow. If any place in Middle-earth might offer hope of breaking the chains that bound the 9, it would be there. The journey through Ithilien was perilous, for the land had become a haunted wilderness where fell things walked in the darkness. Yet Morwen pressed on, guided by fragments of ancient maps and the strange certainty that filled her heart. On the third day, she came at last to the hidden valley, where stone pillars carved with the symbols of Numenor stood sentinel beside a spring of crystal water. There she made her camp and waited, for she knew with mysterious certainty that the Nazgûl would come. The knowledge of her presence would draw him as surely as iron draws to lodestone. And indeed, as the sun set behind the western peaks and shadow crept across the vale, she felt the familiar chill that heralded his approach. He came on foot this time, having left his fell beast at the valley's edge. The black robes moved like liquid shadow as he walked, and the very air seemed to recoil from his presence. Yet Morwen felt no fear, only a deep sadness for the torment she could sense within that terrible form. "Why do you flee from your own people, daughter of Numenor?" Khamûl asked, his voice like wind through autumn leaves. "What madness has possessed you to seek me out in this desolate place?" "Not madness," Morwen replied, rising to face him across the sacred spring. "Understanding. I have read of this place in the ancient texts. Here the faithful built a shrine to the memory of their lost homeland, and here the very stones remember the days when men walked free beneath the stars." The Nazgûl halted at the edge of the sacred circle, and she saw how he swayed, as though buffeted by invisible winds. "You know not what you meddle with," he said, but his voice had lost some of its cold certainty. "This place, it burns." "Yes," Morwen said simply. "It remembers what you have forgotten. It remembers the man you were before the shadow claimed you." And then she began to speak of that man, of Khamûl the king, who had ruled wisely in the distant east and sought only to preserve his people from the decay of years. She spoke of his love for his queen, dead these 3,000 years, and of the children who had looked to him as father and protector. She spoke of honor and nobility, of sacrifice and loss, until the Nazgûl sank to his knees beside the spring, and his terrible keening filled the air. "You cannot know," he whispered through his anguish. "You cannot know what I have done, what I have become. The blood on my hands, the innocents whose lives I have taken in service to the Dark Lord. I am damned beyond all hope of redemption." "Perhaps," Morwen said gently, stepping to the very edge of the circle that separated them. "But damnation is not the same as destruction. Even the darkest night must yield to dawn." As the night deepened around the sacred spring, Morwen watched the Nazgûl struggle with the awakening of memories long buried beneath shadow. The very air seemed to tremble with the conflict raging within him, and more than once she feared that the weight of his anguish might tear him apart entirely. "Speak to me of her," she said at last, her voice soft with compassion. "Your queen. Tell me of the woman you loved." A sound like breaking glass came from beneath the black hood, and for a moment the Nazgûl's form seemed to waver like smoke. "Miriel of the golden hair," he whispered, and the name was spoken with such reverence that it seemed to sanctify the very air. "Fairer than the dawn over the inland sea, wiser than the eldest of my counselors, she begged me not to accept the gift of the Dark Lord, warned me that it would bring only sorrow, but I would not listen. I thought myself wiser than her woman's fears. She loved you," Morwen said simply, "and love does not die, even when the beloved is lost to darkness." "Love?" The Nazgûl's laugh was terrible to hear. "What do I know of love now? I am a creature of shadow and malice, existing only to serve the will of Sauron. The capacity for love was burned from me long ago." "Yet you have not struck me down," Morwen observed. "Though I stand defenseless before one of the nine, you have offered me no harm. Is that not a form of love? A remembrance of what you once were?" The ringwraith was silent for a long moment, his hooded head bowed as though beneath an impossible weight. When he spoke again, his voice held a note she had not heard before, not quite hope, but something that might grow into it with time and nurturing. "I remember," he said slowly, "a garden in the palace of my fathers. White roses grew there, and Miriel would walk among them in the evening hours, singing song the sea. I thought I had forgotten even the sound of her voice. Yet now." He raised one gauntleted hand as though to touch something invisible in the air. Now I hear it again, faint as the whisper of wind through wheat. The Dark Lord promised you eternity, Morwen said, understanding suddenly flooding her mind. But he gave you only endless emptiness, life without love, existence without joy. Is that not the cruelest bondage of all? You speak truth, Khamûl admitted, and there was wonder in his voice. Yet what would you have me do? I am bound by the 9 rings, chained to the will of the Dark Lord until the world's ending. Even should I wish to break free, the way is barred to me. Is it? Morwen stepped closer to the edge of the sacred circle, close enough to see the faint glimmer of the ring upon his finger. The rings of power were wrought by the elven smiths, and their making was sung with words of binding. But every song may be answered with another, every binding countered with the proper key. The Nazgûl looked up sharply, and though she could not see his face beneath the hood, she felt the intensity of his gaze like a physical weight. You speak of the song of making, he said, but that knowledge was lost when Gil-galad fell, and the secrets of the rings went with him into darkness. Not all knowledge dies with its keepers, Morwen replied. The Númenóreans preserved much that others thought lost, and their archives contained lore gathered from many lands and ages. I have read fragments of the song, though I lack the skill to weave them whole. Even if such a thing were possible, Khamûl said, though his voice trembled with something that might have been hope, the attempt would surely draw the attention of the Dark Lord. He would know the moment one of his servants sought to break free, and his wrath would be terrible beyond imagining. Then we must be cleverer than his malice, Morwen said, with a smile that held no trace of fear. We must find a way to mask the working, to hide it from his sight, until it is too late for him to intervene. The Nazgûl stared at her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice held a note of something almost like admiration. You would risk all of Middle-earth for the redemption of one who has served the enemy for 3,000 years. Why? Morwen considered the question, knowing that her answer would shape everything that followed. Because, she said at last, I have seen too much of darkness to believe it is absolute. Because every soul deserves the chance to choose again, no matter how far they may have fallen. And because, she paused, feeling the weight of truth upon her tongue, because I believe that love is stronger than any chain the enemy can forge. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, and after what seemed an eternity, Khamûl reached up with shaking hands and pulled back his hood. Morwen gasped, not at the horror she had expected, but at the terrible beauty of what was revealed. The face was still that of a man, though pale as starlight and marked with the weight of endless years. Dark hair fell to his shoulders, and his eyes were the deep blue of twilight skies, filled with such ancient sadness that her heart nearly broke to see it. Behold the fate of kings, he said quietly. This is what remains when honor is sold for the promise of forever. But Morwen saw more than loss in that noble face. She saw the man Khamûl had been, still present beneath the shadow like a flame guttering but not yet extinct. And in that moment, she made a choice that would echo through all the ages of Middle-earth. She leaned forward and kissed him. The kiss was brief, no more than a gentle touch of lips, yet its effect was as though lightning had struck the sacred spring. The very stones of the ancient shrine blazed with sudden light, and the water leaped and danced as if stirred by invisible hands. Khamûl cried out and fell backward, his form wreathed in silver fire that caused him no pain, but seemed to burn away layers of shadow that had accumulated over long ages. When the light faded, he knelt by the spring's edge, gasping like a man who had nearly drowned and been pulled back to air at the last moment. His pale hands clutched at the stone as though afraid he might dissolve into nothingness, and when he looked up at Morwen, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "What have you done?" he whispered, his voice human now, rather than the hollow tones of the ringwraith. I can feel my heart beating again." Morwen knelt beside him, her own hands trembling with the magnitude of what had occurred. "I don't know," she admitted. "I acted on instinct alone. But look," she pointed to his hand. where the ring of power still gleamed upon his finger, though its light seemed somehow dimmed. The binding is weakened, but not broken. We have begun something here that must be completed, or all will be lost. Even as she spoke, a chill wind began to blow through the valley, and both of them felt the weight of a malevolent gaze turning toward their hidden sanctuary. Far away in Barad-dûr, the Dark Lord had felt the disturbance in the bonds that held his servants, and his anger was like a flame that scorched the very air. "He knows," Khamûl said, struggling to his feet. "Sauron knows that something has changed. We have perhaps hours before his wrath falls upon us. Then we must work swiftly," Morwen replied, her mind racing through the fragments of lore she had gleaned from the ancient text. "The Song of Making. I remember portions of it, but not the whole, and without the complete melody, any attempt to break the ring's power will fail." Khamûl was silent for a moment, his newly awakened face grave with thought. Then, to her surprise, he began to hum, a melody so ancient and beautiful that it seemed to make the very stones sing in harmony. The sound was nothing like the hollow voice of the Nazgûl. Instead, it carried the warmth and nobility of the man he had once been. "I remember this," he said wonderingly, "from the day Sauron first offered me the ring." He sang as he placed it upon my finger, weaving words of binding into melody. But songs work both ways. What can be bound can also be freed, if one knows the proper counter-melody. "You remember the Song of Making?" Morwen asked, hope blazing in her heart. "Not all of it," Khamûl admitted. 3,000 years of darkness have clouded much. But between your fragments and my memories, we might piece together enough to attempt the unmaking. They worked through the night, sharing knowledge that spanned the ages. Morwen spoke of the texts she had studied in Dol Amroth, while Khamûl recalled details of the day his doom was sealed. Slowly, painfully, they began to reconstruct the ancient melody that had once shaped the very foundations of Middle-earth. As dawn approached, they had assembled what they believed to be the complete song. Yet both knew that they would have only one chance. The moment the melody was begun, the Dark Lord would know their purpose and move to stop them. They would need to work with perfect harmony and unwavering will, or the attempt would destroy them both. "Are you ready?" Morwen asked, as the first light of dawn touched the eastern peaks. Khamûl nodded, then reached out and took her hand in his. The touch of his skin was warm now, fully human despite the ring's continued presence upon his finger. "Whatever comes," he said quietly, "know that you have given me the greatest gift imaginable. You have reminded me that I am more than the sum of my failures." Together, they began to sing. The melody that rose from the sacred spring was unlike anything heard in Middle-earth since the music of creation itself. It spoke of freedom and choice, of love that endured beyond death, of light that could pierce even the deepest darkness. The ancient stones responded, their carved symbols blazing with inner fire, and the water of the spring rose, a spiraling column that reached toward the sky. But even as they sang, darkness gathered on the horizon. A great wind arose from the east, bringing with it the sound of fell wings and the screaming of the Nazgûl's remaining servants. The Dark Lord had felt the working and sent his most terrible servants to stop it. "Keep singing," Morwen cried as the shadows closed around them. "Whatever happens, do not stop." Turn. The battle that followed was fought not with sword and spear, but with will and song. The 8 remaining Nazgûl descended upon the valley like a storm of malice, their voices raised in countersong that sought to drown out the melody of freedom. But Morwen and Khamûl sang on, their voices joined in perfect harmony, their wills united in common purpose. The ring upon Khamûl's finger began to smoke and crack, its golden surface showing hairline fractures as the song of unmaking worked its power. He cried out in agony as the breaking began, 3 millennia of bondage fighting against the promise of release. Yet still he sang, his voice growing stronger rather than weaker, as the chains that had bound his soul began to part. And then, in a burst of light that banished the shadows and sent the 8 fleeing back toward Mordor, the ring shattered. Khamûl collapsed beside the spring, free at last, but changed beyond recognition. The pale, ethereal beauty of the ring-wraith was gone, replaced by the weathered features of a mortal man. His dark hair was now streaked with silver, and lines of age and sorrow marked his face. Yet his eyes burned with a light that spoke of hope reborn. "It is finished," he whispered, staring at the fragments of gold that had once enslaved him. "After 3,000 years, I am free." But their triumph was short-lived, for even as they embraced in joy, new shadows were gathering. The breaking of one of the 9 rings had sent shockwaves throughout Middle-earth, and the Dark Lord's rage was like a volcano waiting to erupt. Soon, they knew, all the powers of Mordor would be turned toward finding and destroying. Their flight from the valley began at once, for sanctuary they desperately needed to find. Word of the impossible spread swiftly through Middle-earth, carried by the very winds that had witnessed the breaking of the ring. One of the 9 was free, an event that many had thought could never come to pass. In Rivendell, Elrond felt the change like a great bell tolling, while in Lothlorien, Galadriel paused in her weaving and smiled for the first time in many years. Even in the depths of Moria, the Balrogs stirred uneasily, sensing that the balance of power in the world had shifted. But nowhere was the change felt more keenly than in the Black Tower of Barad-dûr, where Sauron's fury shook the very foundations of Mordor. The breaking of one of the 9 rings was more than mere inconvenience. It was a crack in the very structure of his power, a proof that his dominion was not absolute. Already, he could feel the other rings growing restless upon their bearers' hands, as though the freedom of one had awakened hope in all the rest. "Find them," he commanded his servants, his voice like the rumble of earthquakes. "Find the woman and the traitor who was once Khamûl. Bring them to me alive, that I might teach Middle-earth the price of defying the Lord of Mordor." The hunt began at once. Orcs poured out of the Black Gate like a tide of malice, while fell beasts darkened the sky with their wings. The 8 remaining Nazgûl spread across the lands, their terrible cries echoing from the misty mountains to the Sea of Rhûn. Never before had Sauron committed such forces to a single pursuit, but never before had he faced such a threat to the foundations of his power. Meanwhile, Morwen and Khamûl fled westward through the wild lands of Ithilien, seeking some sanctuary where they might find aid against the gathering storm. The man who had once been a Nazgûl moved with surprising grace for one so newly freed, though Morwen could see the toll that mortality was taking upon him. 3,000 years of deathless existence had not prepared him for the simple needs of flesh and blood, for hunger and thirst, for weariness and the requirement of sleep. "I had forgotten," he said on their second night of flight, as they sheltered in a cave high in the Ephel-Duath, "forgotten what it meant to feel the cold, or to watch the stars wheel overhead, and know that time passes for mortal folk. It is both blessing and burden, this return to life." Morwen tended a small fire while keeping watch for their pursuers, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what they faced. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. "The choice to break free?" Khamûl was silent for a long moment, his weathered face turned toward the fire. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "I regret many things," he said at last. "The innocents who died by my hand, the kingdoms that fell before my armies, the years I spent in service to the enemy of all free peoples. But this," he gestured to encompass the cave, the fire, the simple fact of their shared humanity. "This I do not regret. Better to live one day as a man than eternity as a slave to shadow." Their conversation was interrupted by a sound that chilled both their hearts, the cry of a fell beast echoing through the mountains, answered by another, and then another. The pursuit was closing in, and they would need to find shelter soon, or face a battle they could not hope to win. "There is a place," Khamûl said suddenly, his eyes bright with remembered knowledge, "hidden in these mountains, known only to a few. The Druidin carved it long ago, before ever the Númenóreans came to Middle-earth. If we can reach it before dawn, we might yet escape the hunt." They pressed on through the night, climbing treacherous paths that seemed more suited to mountain goats than human feet. Behind them, the cries of their pursuers grew ever closer, and more than once they were forced to hide as orc patrols passed nearby. But Khamûl's memory proved true, and as the first light of dawn touched the peaks, they came at last to a narrow cleft in the rock face that seemed to lead nowhere. "Here," he said, and pressed his hand to a stone that looked no different from any other. To Morwen's amazement, the rock face swung inward, revealing a passage carved with symbols older than any kingdom of men. They slipped inside just as the sound of wings filled the air above. The passage sealed itself behind them with barely a whisper, leaving them in darkness that seemed profound after their long night of flight. But after a moment, Khamûl struck flint to tinder, and a small torch blazed to life, revealing a tunnel that led deep into the heart of the mountain. "The wild men knew secrets that even the Eldar have forgotten," he said, as they made their way deeper into the hidden ways. "This sanctuary has stood since the Elder days, and not even the eye of Sauron can pierce its veils." The tunnel opened at last into a vast chamber carved from living stone, its walls covered with pictures that told the history of Middle-earth from its very beginning. Here was depicted the music of creation and the coming of the elves to the shores of the uttermost west. There were the two trees of Valinor in all their glory, and the kinstrife that sundered the Eldar. Most wonderful of all, at the chamber's heart stood a pool of water so pure and still that it seemed like a mirror reflecting not the world that was, but the world that might yet be. "This is the Pool of Seeing," Khamûl explained as they approached its edge. "The Druedain used it to glimpse the paths of fate, though few possessed the wisdom to understand what they saw. Perhaps it might show us the way forward, now that we have changed the very structure of destiny." Morwen knelt beside the pool and gazed into its depths. At first, she saw only her own reflection, tired and travel-worn, but determined. Then the surface rippled, though no wind stirred it, and visions began to form in the crystal water. She saw armies marching under banners she did not recognize, and cities burning beneath a sky red with war. She saw the other Nazgûl writhing in their bonds as the echo of Khamûl's freedom reached them, and she saw the Dark Lord himself, terrible in his wrath, preparing to unleash such destruction as Middle-earth had never known. But beneath it all, running like a golden thread through the tapestry of war, she saw something else, hope growing where none had been before, and light kindling in the darkest places. "The breaking of your chains has begun something greater than we imagined," she told Khamûl, as the visions faded. "The other rings of power are weakening, their hold upon their bearers growing ever more tenuous. If we can find the others, if we can teach them what we learned in the sacred spring, then perhaps all nine might yet be freed." Khamûl stared at her with wonder and growing hope. "You speak of a work that might span years, perhaps decades. The risk would be beyond measure, and the Dark Lord will spend all his power to stop us. Then we must be stronger than his malice," Morwen replied, her gray eyes blazing with determination. "We must gather allies, learn new songs of making and unmaking, and prepare for a war not of swords, but of souls." As if summoned by her words, a new vision formed in the pool, clearer than any that had come before. She saw herself and Khamûl standing before the gates of Minas Tirith, and beside them walked figures she recognized from the ancient lore. There was Gil-galad returned from the uttermost west, and Elrond bearing one of the 3 rings of the elves. There was Gandalf the White, his staff blazing with power, and behind them came an army not of men, but of those who had once been slaves to darkness. Nazgûl freed from their bonds and restored to the light. "The final battle," she whispered, and in her voice was both fear and exultation. "This is what we are truly meant to do, not merely to free one servant of the enemy, but to turn his greatest strength against him." The vision faded, leaving them alone in the ancient sanctuary, but the hope it had kindled burned bright in both their hearts, and they knew their true quest was only beginning. 7 days they sheltered in the hidden sanctuary of the Druedain, while above them the hunt raged across the mountains of Ithilien. The Pool of Seeing showed them glimpses of their pursuers, orc armies combing every cave and crevice, fell beasts circling endlessly overhead, and the 8 Nazgûl spreading their net ever wider in search of the fugitive. Yet the ancient magic that protected the sanctuary held firm, and their enemies passed by without sensing the prize that lay hidden beneath their very feet. It was during those days of enforced refuge that Morwen and Khamûl began to plan their next move. The visions in the pool of seeing had shown them glimpses of what might be, but the path to that future remained shrouded in uncertainty. They would need allies, powerful ones, who understood the true nature of the rings and possessed the wisdom to aid in their breaking. "We must reach Rivendell," Khamûl said, as they studied the ancient maps carved into the chamber walls. "Lord Elrond bears Vilya, mightiest of the 3, and his knowledge of the rings making surpasses that of any in Middle-earth. If anyone can teach us the full song of unmaking, it would be he. The journey will be perilous," Morwen observed, tracing the route with her finger. "We must cross the Anduin, pass through the misty mountains, and traverse lands where every shadow might hide our enemy. And even if we reach the hidden valley, what guarantee have we that the Lord of Rivendell will aid us? To him, you are still one who served the enemy for 3,000 years. Khamûl's face grew grave at her words, for he knew them to be true. "You speak wisely," he admitted. "The Eldar have long memories, and my crimes under the shadow are not easily forgotten. Yet we must try, for without their aid, our hope of freeing the others grows ever dimmer." On the 8th morning, the pool of seeing showed them a change in the pattern of the hunt. The orc armies were withdrawing eastward, recalled to Mordor by their master's urgent summons. Only the Nazgûl remained, but they too seemed less focused in their search, as though some greater urgency demanded their attention. "The war begins," Khamûl said, his voice heavy with understanding. "Sauron masses his forces for the final assault upon Gondor. He cannot spare infinite time for our pursuit, not when the fate of his realm hangs in the balance." "Then, now is our chance," Morwen replied. "While his attention is turned to war, we must make our move." They left the sanctuary at twilight, emerging into a world transformed by conflict. Smoke rose from burning villages in the distance, and the very air seemed charged with the tension of approaching battle. Yet for all the danger that surrounded them, Morwen felt her spirits lift as they began their westward journey. They were moving forward at last, taking action rather than merely hiding from their fate. The first part of their journey took them through the ruins of Osgiliath, where the broken bridges and shattered towers stood as mute testament to the war's ferocity. Here they were forced to move with utmost caution, for orc patrols still guarded the crossing, and the sky above was never free from the wings of fell beasts. It was as they sheltered in the ruins of what had once been a great library that they encountered their first sign of hope. A company of rangers had taken refuge there, grim men of the north, who served as the hidden guardians of Eriador. Their leader was a weathered veteran named Halbarad, and his eyes widened in recognition when he saw Khamûl's face. "You bear a strong resemblance to someone I have seen in evil dreams," he said carefully, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "Yet there is something different about you, a light, where before there was only shadow." "I am Khamûl," the former Nazgûl replied simply, "though no longer what I once was. The lady beside me has freed me from the bondage of the ring, and now we seek to do the same for my former brethren." The rangers tensed at his words, several drawing steel, but Halbarad raised a hand for calm. "Speak truth," he commanded. "Are you truly free of the Dark Lord's dominion?" In answer, Khamûl held up his hand where the ring had once gleamed. The finger bore only a pale scar now, like the mark of an old burn, but even that seemed to glow with its own inner light. "The chain is broken," he said. "I am my own man once more, for good or ill." Halbarad studied him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "I have heard whispers from the east, rumors that one of the 9 had vanished from the Dark Lord's sight. The free peoples dared not hope it might be true." He turned to Morwen with something like reverence in his eyes. "Lady, if you have indeed accomplished this thing, then you have struck a blow against the enemy that may yet prove decisive. The blow is struck, but the battle is far from won. Morwen replied, "We seek passage to Rivendell, that we might learn how to free the others. Will you aid us?" "More than aid you," Halbarad said with a fierce smile. "I will escort you myself, for this news must reach Lord Elrond with all speed. The very fate of the war may hang upon it." The journey to Rivendell took them through lands scarred by war and shadow. They traveled by night and sheltered by day, always moving westward through paths known only to the Rangers. Twice they were forced to fight, once against a patrol of orcs that had strayed too far from their commands, and once against wolves that had grown bold and savage in the chaos of war. In both battles, Khamûl proved his worth as an ally. Though he no longer possessed the terrible power of a Nazgûl, his skill with blade and bow remained formidable, honed by 3 millennia of warfare. Yet it was his knowledge of the enemy's tactics that proved most valuable, for he could predict their movements with uncanny accuracy and guide the company away from the larger forces that prowled the darkness. "You fight well for one so newly returned to mortality," Halbarad observed, as they cleaned their weapons after the wolf attack. "I remember the man I was before the shadow claimed me," Khamûl replied quietly. "A king must know the arts of war, whether he serves in light or darkness. The skills remain, though I pray I need never use them in service of evil again." On the 10th night of their journey, they came at last to the hidden paths that led to Rivendell. The very air seemed lighter here, filled with the music of running water and the whisper of ancient trees. As they descended into the valley, Morwen felt her heart lift with wonder, for never had she seen a place so fair or so untouched by the darkness that plagued the rest of Middle-earth. The guards who met them at the valley's edge were elves of noble bearing, their bright mail gleaming silver in the starlight. Their captain was Gil-galad, not the ancient High King himself, but one who bore his name in honor of that fallen lord. His eyes widened in shock when he saw Khamûl, and for a moment it seemed he might draw sword and attack. "Hold," Halbarad said quickly. "This one comes in peace, bearing news that Lord Elrond must hear." "News?" Gil-galad's voice was cold as winter wind. "What news could one of the 9 bring, save treachery and deceit?" "The news that one of the 9 is no longer," Morwen interjected, stepping forward with all the dignity of her royal lineage. "I am Morwen of Dol Amroth, daughter of Prince Imrahil's house, and I bear witness to a deed that may change the very course of the war." The elf lord studied her for a long moment, then his gaze shifted to Khamûl. Something in the former Nazgûl's bearing seemed to give him pause, for the terrible aura of shadow that had once surrounded him was gone entirely, replaced by the simple presence of a mortal man. "Come then," Gil-galad said at last. "Lord Elrond will judge the truth of your words." They were escorted through the winding paths of Rivendell, past gardens where flowers bloomed eternal, and fountains sang with voices like crystal bells. The beauty of the place was almost overwhelming after the darkness they had traveled through, and Morwen found tears upon her cheeks as they climbed the steps to the last homely house. Lord Elrond awaited them in his great hall, and with him stood others of the White Council. Gandalf the Grey, his weathered face grave with concern, and Glorfindel the golden-haired, whose very presence seemed to banish shadow. They had been deep in council when the messengers arrived, discussing the progress of the war and the movements of the enemy. "So," Elrond said, as the travelers were brought before him, "Halbarad brings us the impossible, one of the Nazgûl walking free in his own will, and beside him the lady who claims to have worked this miracle." "It is no claim, my lord," Morwen replied, her voice steady despite the awe that filled her heart. "With my own eyes I saw the ring shatter, and with my own hands I helped sing the song that broke his chains." Gandalf stepped forward, his keen eyes studying Khamûl with an intensity that seemed to pierce to the very soul. "Remarkable," he murmured after a long moment. "The darkness that once clung to you like a second skin is gone entirely. Yet how can this be? The rings of power were wrought with binding spells beyond the skill of any to break." "Not beyond all skill," Khamûl replied. The lady found fragments of the Song of Making in the archives of Numenor, and I remembered portions of the binding melody from the day of my enslavement. Together, we were able to piece together enough of the countersong to break the ring's hold. Fragments! Elrond's eyes grew bright with sudden understanding. Show me these fragments. Let me see what knowledge you have gathered. For the next hour, Morwen recited every word she could remember from the ancient text, while Khamûl hummed the melodies that had haunted his memory for 3,000 years. As they spoke, Elrond's expression grew ever more amazed, and when they finished, he sat in silence for a long moment. "This is indeed the true Song of Making," he said at last, "or rather, it is portions of that song, scattered and incomplete. The full melody was lost when Gil-galad fell at the siege of Barad-dûr, for he alone among the wise knew all its verses." He paused, his ageless face troubled. "Yet, what you have accomplished with mere fragments is beyond my highest hopes. If the complete song could be recovered." "Could it be done?" Morwen asked eagerly. "Could all 9 be freed from their bondage?" "Perhaps," Elrond said slowly, "but the knowledge you seek lies not in Middle-earth, but in the uttermost west, in the halls of Manwë himself, and the path to that realm is barred to all but the Eldar, and even then only to those summoned by the Valar themselves." A heavy silence fell upon the chamber, for all understood the implications of his words. The hope they had kindled seemed to dim, facing the impossible barrier of the sundering sea. But then Gandalf spoke, his voice carrying a note of excitement that had not been heard in many days. "Perhaps not so impossible as it seems," he said slowly, "for I know of one who has walked in both worlds, who has spoken with the Valar themselves, and returned to tell of it." All eyes turned to him in amazement, for such a thing was beyond the experience of any in Middle-earth. "Who?" Elrond asked, though something in his expression suggested he already guessed the answer. "Arundel the Mariner," Gandalf replied, "he who bears the Silmaril across the sky, and whose ship sails even now between the circles of the world. If any could carry our plea to the uttermost west, and return with the knowledge we seek, it would be he." Hope blazed anew in every heart, yet even as it did, they all knew the magnitude of what was being proposed. To call upon Arundel would require a working of power beyond anything attempted since the Elder Days, and there was no guarantee that even he could accomplish what they asked. Yet as Morwen looked around the chamber at the faces of the wise and noble, she saw determination growing to match her own. The war for Middle-earth would be won or lost not by armies alone, but by the courage to attempt the impossible. "How long would such a working take?" she asked. "If it can be done at all," Elrond replied carefully, "it would require the combined power of all 3 elven rings, and perhaps a full turning of the moon to complete." "Then we must begin at once," Morwen said, with the authority of one born to command. "For every day we delay, the enemy grows stronger, and those who remain in bondage to the rings suffer under their chains." The Council of the Wise exchanged glances, and she saw the moment when their resolve crystallized. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk, they would attempt to call the mariner home from his eternal voyage among the stars. The working began 3 nights later, when the moon was dark and the stars shone with their clearest light. Upon the highest tower of Rivendell, the 3 bearers of the elven rings took their places. Elrond with Vilya the blue, Gandalf with Narya the red, and from Lothlorien came Galadriel herself, bearing Nenya the white. Never before had the 3 been brought together in such close harmony, and their combined radiance was like a second dawn breaking over the hidden valley. Morwen and Khamûl stood at the circle's edge, adding their voices to the great working. Though they bore no rings of power, their knowledge of the Song of Making proved invaluable, for the melody they had used to break Khamûl's bonds formed the foundation upon which the greater song was built. For 7 nights they labored, weaving music and starlight into a call that could pierce even the veil between the worlds. The very air above Rivendell shimmered with power, and those with the sight reported seeing shapes of light dancing among the clouds. The forms of great eagles, perhaps, or the sails of ships that sailed seas not made of water. On the 8th night, their efforts were rewarded. A star that had shone constant in the western sky began to move, growing brighter as it descended toward Middle-earth. The assembled watchers gasped in wonder and fear, for they were witnessing something that had not occurred since the First Age, the return of Arundel from his eternal voyage through the heavens. The starship touched the earth in the gardens of Rivendell with no more sound than a whisper of wind through leaves. From its gleaming hull stepped a figure that seemed wrought of starlight itself, tall and noble, with eyes that held the memory of both the uttermost west and the sorrows of Middle-earth. Upon his brow gleamed the Silmaril, that holy jewel which had been the cause of so much strife in the elder days. "I have heard your call across the circles of the world," Arundel said, his voice carrying the music of the sea and sky. "Speak now of this need that has drawn me from my appointed path." Elrond stepped forward, his own father, though ages had passed since last they met. "Great mariner," he said with deep reverence, "we seek knowledge that was lost when Gil-galad fell, the complete song of making, that we might break the chains that bind the Nine to the Dark Lord's will." Arendel's gaze moved to Khamûl, and the former Nazgûl felt his presence like a weight of stars. "I see that one has already been freed," the mariner observed. "This is well done, though the working was perilous beyond measure. You ask for knowledge that the Valor guard closely, for songs of such power could unmake more than rings if used unwisely. Yet surely they would not deny aid to those who seek to undo the works of the enemy," Galadriel said, her own light seeming to harmonize with that of the Silmaril. "The Nine were made in defiance of the Valar's will. Would it not serve justice to see them broken?" Arundel was silent for a long moment, his eyes turned toward the west, where lay the Blessed Realm. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of authority from the highest powers in Arda. "The Valar have indeed considered this matter," he said. "They have watched the working of your will with great interest, for the freeing of one so long bound to darkness speaks to the power of love and courage to overcome even the mightiest evil. Yet they are not blind to the dangers inherent in such knowledge." Morwen felt her heart sink, fearing that their plea would be denied. But Arundel raised a hand, and his expression grew solemn rather than negative. "Therefore," he continued, "they have decreed a test. The complete Song of Making shall be granted to you, but only if you can prove worthy of its power. 3 trials you must face, trials of wisdom, courage, and sacrifice. Only if all 3 are passed will the full knowledge be yours." "What manner of trial?" Khamûl asked, though his voice showed no hesitation, despite the ominous nature of the mariner's words. "The first trial is already begun," Arundel replied with something that might have been a smile. "For wisdom is found not in the seeking of power, but in the willing surrender of it when the greater good demands. The Lady Morwen has shown such wisdom in seeking to free those who were her enemy. You, Khamûl, who was Nazgûl, have shown it in choosing mortality over deathless servitude." A golden light began to surround both Morwen and Khamûl, and they felt knowledge flowing into their minds, not the complete song, but a deeper understanding of the melodies they already knew. The fragments they had pieced together suddenly revealed their full potential, and they saw how they might be woven into workings of incredible complexity. "The trial of wisdom is past," Arundel declared. "Now comes the trial of courage, which shall test not your willingness to face danger, but your determination to persevere when all hope seems lost." Even as he spoke, darkness began to gather at the edges of the valley. The hunt that had been called off was beginning anew, for the Dark Lord had felt the disturbance caused by the mariners' arrival. Fell beasts descended from the sky, while orc armies poured through the passes, all converging on Rivendell with malevolent purpose. "The enemy comes in force," Gandalf observed grimly. "We cannot hope to stand against such numbers." "Nor are we meant to," Arundel replied. "The trial demands not victory in battle, but the courage to continue the great work, even while under siege. Can you complete the second part of the song while battle rages around you?" Morwen looked at the approaching darkness, then at the assembled defenders of Rivendell. Elrond's household guard was already taking positions along the valley's rim, their bright mail gleaming in the starlight. Beside them stood the ranger who had escorted her and Kamul, their bows strung and ready. It would be a fierce fight, and there was no guarantee that any would survive to see the dawn. "We can," she said simply, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "We must." The battle for Rivendell began just as the second part of the song was commenced. While orcs swarmed down the mountainsides and fell beasts circled overhead like vultures, the bearers of the three rings stood fast in their working. The music of creation rose above the clash of weapons and the screams of the dying, weaving patterns of power that made the very stars dance in their courses. Kamul fought beside the defenders, his sword singing as it cut down orc after orc. Yet even in the heat of battle, his voice never faltered in the song, adding his knowledge of the enemy's tactics to the melody of making. When a cave troll broke through the outer defenses, it was his quick thinking that turned the beast's charge into a trap, sending it tumbling into a ravine from which it would not emerge. For 3 hours the battle raged, and for 3 hours the song continued. Just as it seemed the defenses might be overwhelmed, the second trial reached its climax. Light blazed from the tower where the ring-bearers stood, and every orc within a league was struck blind. The fell beast shrieked and fled, unable to bear the radiance, while their riders were cast down to earth. "The trial of courage is past," Arundel announced, though his voice was strained with the effort of the working. "Now comes the final test, the trial of sacrifice. This will be the hardest of all, for it demands that you give up that which you value most." Morwen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air, for she suspected what was to come. The final part of the Song of Making was the most dangerous, requiring a sacrifice of power so great that those who attempted it might not survive. To complete the working and gain the knowledge they sought, someone would have to give up their very life force, their connection to the light that made them who they were. "I will do it," Kamul said without hesitation. "I have been given a second chance at life and love. If my sacrifice can free my former brethren and help defeat the darkness, then I count it well spent." "No," Morwen said firmly, taking his hand in hers. "We began this together, and we shall finish it together. If sacrifice is required, then let us both pay the price." Arundel watched them with eyes that held both sadness and approval. "Love shared is love multiplied," he said softly. "If you would face this trial together, then perhaps the sacrifice need not be as great as feared." Hand in hand, Morwen and Kamul stepped into the circle of power. Around them, the bearers of the three rings began the final movement of the Song of Making, a melody so complex and beautiful that it seemed to contain within it the very essence of creation itself. As the music reached its crescendo, both felt their life force being drawn into the working, their mortal shells becoming conduit for power beyond imagining. The pain was incredible, yet also strangely euphoric. They felt themselves becoming part of something greater than any individual existence, part of the music that had shaped the world at its beginning and would guide it to its end. Through their sacrifice, the complete knowledge of the Song of Making flowed into their minds, every note and harmony mapped out in perfect detail. When the working was complete, they found themselves still alive, though changed. Their hair had turned silver white, and their eyes now held flecks of starlight. They had given up their purely mortal nature, becoming something between human and elf, not immortal, but possessed of greatly extended years and wisdom beyond their apparent age. "It is done," Arundel said with deep satisfaction. "The trials are past, and the knowledge is yours. Use it well, for the fate of all Middle-earth may hang upon your success." The mariner's ship began to glow with inner light as he prepared to return to his eternal voyage. But before he departed, he turned to address them one final time. "Know this," he said solemnly. "The breaking of the 9 will not be easily accomplished. Each ring must be approached differently, for each was bound with unique melodies that reflected the nature of its bearer. Some may welcome freedom, while others may resist it, and the Dark Lord will not remain idle while his servants are stolen from him." "We understand the dangers," Morwen replied, but we also understand what victory might bring. Not just the defeat of Sauron, but the redemption of those who were lost to his lies. Arundel smiled then, and his face was radiant with hope. Then go forth with the blessing of the valor upon you. May your song of unmaking echo through all the ages of the world. The starship rose into the night sky, carrying the mariner back to his appointed path among the heavens. But the knowledge he had brought remained, burning bright in the minds of those who would use it to change the fate of Middle-earth. With the complete song of making now echoing in their minds, Morwen and Khamûl began to plan their assault upon the remaining Nazgûl. The task ahead was daunting beyond measure, for each of the 8 would need to be approached individually, and their master would not be slow to learn of their purpose. Once the first attempt was made, "We must choose our targets carefully," Khamûl advised, as they studied maps in Elrond's library. "Some of my former brethren will be more receptive to freedom than others. The Witch King himself will be the most difficult, for his will was strongest even before he took the ring. But there are others who might welcome the chance to break their chains." "Tell me of them," Morwen said, settling beside him at the great table where charts of Middle-earth lay spread like fallen leaves. Khamûl's transformed features grew thoughtful as he considered. "There is Akorahil, who was once a great sorcerer in the south. Pride was always his weakness, and he chafes under any authority save his own. If approached correctly, he might be convinced that freedom serves his interest better than bondage. And the others? Hormarath of Dir was a warrior king, much like myself. The loss of honor galls him most of all, though he hides it well. Adunafel the Quiet was a noble woman of Númenor who valued beauty and art above all things. The desolation of her existence as a Nazgûl has left her filled with resentment. Any of these 3 might be turned, given the right approach. They spent days in preparation, consulting with the wise of Rivendell, and crafting specific variants of the Song of Making for each potential target. Lord Elrond provided them with maps showing the current movements of the enemy forces, while Gandalf shared intelligence gathered by his many agents throughout Middle-earth. Their first target would be Akorahil, for he was currently operating alone in the southern regions of Gondor, cut off from the main army by the movements of Prince Imrahil's forces. If they could reach him while he was isolated, they might have a chance to attempt the working without interference from his brethren. The journey south took them through lands ravaged by war. Smoke rose from burning villages, and the roads were clogged with refugees fleeing the advancing armies of Mordor. Yet, their changed nature served them well, for the touch of starlight upon them made common folk step aside with unconscious reverence, while servants of the enemy seemed unable to perceive them clearly. It was in the ruins of Pelargir that they finally caught up with their quarry. Akorahil had taken the ancient city for his stronghold, using its position on the Anduin to control river traffic and harry the forces of Gondor. The sight of the great harbor filled with black ships, the proud towers crowned with the banners of Mordor, filled Morwen's heart with grief, but she forced herself to focus on the task at hand. "He will be in the Tower of the Moon," Khamûl said, pointing to the highest spire of the citadel. "Always he favored high places, that he might look down upon lesser beings. His pride will be our key to reaching him." They entered the city under cover of darkness, their starlight-touched nature allowing them to pass unseen among the orc patrol. The climb to the tower's peak was treacherous, for Akorahil had set many guardians along the way, fell spirits bound to his will, and creatures of shadow that hungered for mortal flesh. Yet the Song of Making had given them power beyond their mortal origins, and they turned aside each threat with melodies that banished darkness and confusion. At last, they stood before the chamber where Akorahil held court, a vast circular room lined with mirrors that reflected not truth, but the sorcerer's own distorted perceptions. The Nazgûl himself sat upon a throne of black stone, his form wreathed in shadows that seemed to writhe with malevolent life. "So," his voice echoed through the chamber like the whisper of winter wind, "the traitor Khamûl comes calling, and brings with him the mortal witch who broke his chains. Did you think to approach me unnoticed? I have felt your presence since you entered my domain. Then you know why we have come." Morwen replied, stepping forward without fear. "We offer you what your pride has always demanded. True freedom, not the mockery of power that Sauron grants his slave." Akorahil's laughter was terrible to hear, like the sound of breaking glass. "Freedom? What do you know of freedom, little mortal? I am deathless, possessed of power beyond the dreams of kings. What could you offer that would surpass such gifts?" "The chance to be yourself again," Khamûl said quietly. "To remember the man you were before the shadow claimed you. Do you not grow weary of serving another's will, great sorcerer? Does it not gall your pride to bow before the Dark Lord like a common orc?" For a moment, something flickered in the depths of Akorahil's hooded visage, a spark of the man he had once been. But then the shadows closed around him again, and his voice grew cold with renewed malice. "Pretty words," he hissed, "but I know the price of your freedom." I felt Khamûl's transformation across the vast distances, felt the agony of mortality returning to claim him. "You offer me death in exchange for chain, and think to call it gift? I offer you choice," Morwen countered. "The choice to live again, to love again, to find meaning beyond the endless hunger for dominion. Yes, mortality brings pain and loss, but it also brings joy and wonder that you have forgotten in your deathless existence." The battle that followed was not one of swords or sorcery, but of wills and words. For 3 hours they argued while the Song of Making built in power around them, each side seeking to convince the other of their cause. Akorahil's pride warred with his hidden longing for freedom, while the dark whispers of his ring sought to maintain their hold upon his soul. In the end, it was not argument that won the day, but memory. Morwen began to sing, not the Song of Making, but a simple melody she had learned in childhood, a lullaby her mother had sung in the gardens of Dol Amroth. The tune was sweet and pure, speaking of home and love and all the gentle pleasures that mortality could offer. As her voice rose in the chamber, the mirrors around them began to show true reflections for the first time in centuries. Akorahil saw himself as he truly was, not the mighty sorcerer lord he imagined, but a withered thing sustained only by malice, the power of his ring. And in that moment of revelation, his resistance crumbled. "Sing it," he whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of 3,000 years of suppressed emotion. "Sing the Song of Making, and let me remember what it means to be human." The working that followed was the most difficult they had yet attempted, for Akorahil's ring was bound with spells of pride and domination that fought against every note of the freedom song. Yet their combined will proved stronger than the ancient binding, and at last the ring cracked and fell from the sorcerer's finger, a shower of golden sparks. The transformation was immediate and shocking. The shadows fell away from Akorahil like a discarded cloak, revealing a man of middle years with graying hair and eyes that sparkled with newfound life. He was no longer the tall, terrible figure of the Nazgûl, but neither was he the withered corpse that his true age should have made him. The power of the song had restored him to the prime of his mortal years, though his face bore the weight of wisdom and sorrow earned through long experience. "It is done," he said, wonderingly, flexing fingers that could feel warmth and texture once again. "I am free. After all these years, I am free." But their celebration was short-lived, for the breaking of the second ring had sent shockwaves through the spiritual realm that the Dark Lord could not ignore. Even as they embraced their newest ally, the sound of fell wings filled the air above Pelargir. "They come," Khamûl said grimly, listening to the approaching cries. "The remaining 7 have been sent to stop us. We must flee, and quickly." Their escape from Pelargir was harrowing, for the other Nazgûl were swift in their pursuit and terrible in their wrath. Morwen and her companions were forced to use every trick and stratagem they could devise, leading their enemies through a maze of ruined buildings and hidden passages before finally breaking clear of the city. As they rode hard toward the safety of the mountains, Akorahil, who had chosen to reclaim his mortal name of Tarostar, spoke of what they had accomplished. 2 of the 9 are free," he said with satisfaction. 5 more remain in bondage, plus the Witch King himself. But the balance has shifted, and Sauron will not underestimate us again. The next attempt will be far more dangerous. Then we must be more clever than his malice, Morwen replied, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. We must find allies among the other races of Middle-earth, and we must strike where he least expects it. Behind them, the black ships of Pelargir burned like signal fires in the night, and the remaining Nazgûl circled overhead, like vultures, their cries echoing across the water. The real war was only beginning. News of the second freed Nazgûl spread through Middle-earth like ripples from a stone cast into still water. In Minas Tirith, Denethor called his council to debate what this might mean for the defense of Gondor. In Edoras, King Theoden felt hope stir in his heart for the first time in many years. Even in the depths of Moria, the Balrog paused in its brooding, sensing that the ancient patterns of power were shifting. But nowhere was the news felt more keenly than in Barad-dûr, where the Dark Lord's rage shook the very foundations of his fortress. The loss of 2 Nazgûl was more than a tactical setback. It was a crack in the fundamental structure of his power, proof that even his most trusted servants could be turned against him. In the highest chamber of the Dark Tower, the Witch King knelt before his master's throne, feeling the weight of terrible displeasure like a physical force. Of all the 9, he alone had never wavered in his loyalty, never questioned the wisdom of accepting the ring's gift. Yet now even he felt something stirring in the depths of his being, not doubt, but a curious resonance with the freedom his former brethren had found. "My lord," he said, his voice hollow as the wind through empty graves, "permit me to hunt them down myself. I know their minds, their weaknesses. Where the others have failed, I shall succeed." "No!" Sauron's voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Too great is the risk that you too might fall to their blandish. You shall remain here, safe from their corrupting influence." The Witch King raised his hooded head, and for the first time in 3 millennia, something like defiance flickered in his voice. "My lord questions my loyalty after all these years of faithful service?" The silence that followed was pregnant with danger, and the Witch King felt the weight of his master's attention like a crushing force. Yet still, he did not bow his head or beg forgiveness. Something had changed in him. Some spark of his former pride as a king of men had been kindled by the knowledge that freedom was possible. "Your loyalty has never been in question," Sauron said at last, though his tone held a note of cold calculation. "Yet these rebels possess knowledge that even I find troubling. The Song of Making was thought lost forever, yet somehow they have recovered it. Until I understand how this was accomplished, you shall not risk yourself against them." The dismissal was clear, yet the Witch King lingered a moment longer. "And what of the war, my lord? My remaining brethren are needed for the assault on Minas Tirith." "The war proceeds as planned," Sauron replied. "The free peoples gather their strength, but they cannot stand against the full might of Mordor. Soon their white city shall fall, and with it all hope of resistance to my will." Yet even as he spoke these words, the Dark Lord felt a tremor of uncertainty that he had not experienced in long ages. The freeing of 2 Nazgûl had upset the careful balance of power he had spent centuries establishing. If more could be turned, if the rebels succeeded in their ultimate goal, he banished such thoughts with an effort of will. The Witch King was loyal beyond question, and the remaining 5 were bound too tightly by their rings to be easily swayed. The rebellion would be crushed, and Middle-earth would kneel before him as was always intended. Meanwhile, far to the west, Morwen and her companions had taken refuge in the abandoned stronghold of Isengard, where Saruman's defeat had left only empty towers and broken machinery. The irony of sheltering in the fortress of another fallen Dark Lord was not lost on them, yet it provided the security they needed to plan their next move. "The Witch King will be expecting us to strike at one of the others," Tarastar observed, as they studied maps of Mordor in the ruins of Orthanc. "He knows our tactics now, knows that we seek to turn his brethren against their master. We must do something unexpected. What do you suggest? Morwen asked, though something in the former sorcerer's tone suggested he had already formed a plan. We strike at the heart, Tarastar replied with a fierce smile. We go after the Witch King himself. Kamul looked up sharply from the ancient tome he was studying. That would be suicide. He is the strongest of the 9, the most loyal to the Dark Lord. If anyone could resist the Song of Making, it would be him. Perhaps, Tarastar conceded. But consider this. If we could turn him, the psychological impact alone might shatter Sauron's confidence. The Witch King has been his most trusted servant for 3,000 years. His betrayal would be a blow from which the Dark Lord might never recover. Morwen felt her heart race with the audacity of the proposal. Everything they had accomplished so far had been building toward this moment, the chance to strike at Sauron's greatest strength and turn it against him. Yet, the risks were enormous. How would we even reach him? She asked. He will be guarded by all the forces of Barad-dûr, surrounded by defenses we cannot hope to breach. Not necessarily, Kamul said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his transformed features. There is one place where the Witch King goes alone, one time when even Sauron's vigilance relaxed. He pointed to a location on the map, a desolate valley in the heart of Mordor, where ancient stones marked a site of dark significance. The Samath Naur, he said quietly, the Chambers of Fire, where the Ring of Power was forged. Once each year, on the anniversary of Sauron's first defeat, the Witch King goes there alone to renew his vows of loyalty. It is a ritual as old as his servitude, and he will not break it even now. When? Morwen asked, though she dreaded the answer. 3 days hence, Kamul replied. The timing could not be more perfect or more dangerous. The entire war effort depends on whether we can reach him before his ritual is complete. The journey to Mordor was the most perilous they had yet undertaken. They traveled in disguise, using the power of the song to mask their true nature from the countless patrols that guarded the Blackland's borders. Tarastar's knowledge of sorcery proved invaluable, allowing them to pass through the enemy's lines like shadows among shadows. As they drew closer to Mount Doom, the very air seemed to thicken with malevolence. The sky above was perpetually overcast, lit only by the red glow of the mountain's fires. Ash fell like snow from the poisoned clouds, and the ground beneath their feet was cracked and barren. I had forgotten, Kamul murmured as they climbed the treacherous paths that led to the Samath Naur. How oppressive this place truly is. The weight of Sauron's will presses down like a physical force. Yet you endured it for 3,000 years, Morwen observed. I endured it because I had no choice, he replied. The ring bound my will so tightly that I could not even conceive of escape. Only now, in freedom, do I realize the true horror of what I was. They reached the Chambers of Fire just as the Witch King arrived for his annual pilgrimage. From their hiding place among the rocks, they watched as the greatest of the Nazgûl dismounted from his fell beast and walked alone into the caverns where his doom had been sealed so long ago. Now, Morwen whispered, and together they began to sing. The Song of Making echoed through the ancient chambers, its melody weaving around the pillars of stone and the rivers of molten rock. But this time, they sang not just of freedom, but of kingship, of honor and nobility, of the crown that had once graced the Witch King's brow before he traded it for endless servitude. The Nazgûl stopped in his tracks as the music reached him, his hooded head turning toward the sound. For a moment, he stood frozen like a statue carved from shadow. Then, slowly, he began to walk toward them. I wondered when you would come, he said, his voice carrying none of the hollow menace they had expected. I have felt your song in my dreams these past days, felt the chains that bind me growing ever looser. Morwen stepped out of hiding, her heart pounding with hope and terror. You knew we were here? I have known since you entered Mordor, the Witch King replied. My master's attention is turned toward the war in the west. He does not watch me as closely as he once did. Nurse, then you will listen to our offer? Tarastar asked, emerging from the shadows. The Witch King was silent for a long moment, his invisible gaze fixed upon the fires of Mount Doom. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of centuries. "I was a king once," he said quietly, "king of Angmar, ruler of the North. I thought myself wise, accepting the gift of the Dark Lord in exchange for eternal life and power. I did not know that eternity without purpose is the cruelest torture of all." He turned to face them, and they saw that his hands were trembling. Whether with hope or fear, they could not tell. "Sing your song," he commanded. "Let me remember what it means to be a man." The final working began in the very heart of Sauron's power, in the chambers where the One Ring had been forged, and where the Witch King had first surrendered his soul to darkness. The irony was profound, that the place of his enslavement should become the site of his liberation. Yet as Morwen, Khamûl, and Tarostar began to weave the song of making around the greatest of the Nazgûl, they discovered that this breaking would be unlike any they had attempted before. The Witch King's ring was not merely bound with spells of domination. It was the cornerstone of all the nine, the master pattern from which the others had been derived. To break it would require every fragment of knowledge they possessed, every note of the ancient melody that Arundel had brought from the uttermost west. The Witch King stood motionless in the center of their circle. As the music built around him, his form wreathed in shadows that seemed to writhe with malevolent life. Yet beneath the darkness, they could sense something stirring. The man he had once been, fighting to break free from millennia of bondage. "I remember," he whispered, as the song reached its first crescendo, "a throne room in Carn Dûm, where my knights knelt before me in loyalty freely given. I remember the weight of a crown upon my brow, and the knowledge that I ruled by right and honor, not by fear." The shadows around him began to thin, revealing glimpses of the man beneath. But even as they did, alarms began to sound throughout Barad-dûr. The Dark Lord had felt the disturbance at last, and his attention was turning like a crushing weight toward the Samath Naur. "He comes," Khamûl gasped, feeling the familiar chill of his former master's regard. "We must finish this quickly, or all is lost." But the Witch King's binding was too strong, too deeply rooted to be broken swiftly. Layer upon layer of servitude had been woven into his very being, each strand requiring careful unraveling lest the whole structure collapse and destroy him entirely. "There is another way," Tarostar said suddenly, his voice tight with desperate inspiration. "The Song of Making speaks of choices, of the power of free will to overcome any bondage. But choice must be offered, not forced." "What do you mean?" Morwen asked, though she feared she already knew. "The Witch King must choose his own freedom," Tarostar explained. "We cannot break his chains for him. He must break them himself, using the power of his own will." The former sorcerer turned to the figure at the circle's center, his transformed features grave with the magnitude of what he proposed. "Great King," he said formally, "we offer you a choice. Remain as you are, bound but deathless, servant but safe, or take up the crown you cast aside and rule yourself once more, knowing that freedom comes with the price of mortality." The Witch King raised his hooded head, and for the first time in 3,000 years, laughter echoed in the chambers of fire, not the hollow mockery of the Nazgûl, but the genuine mirth of a man who had found something worth living for. "Choice?" he said, and his voice was growing warmer with each word. "You offer me choice, when for so long I have been nothing but an extension of another's will? There is no choice to be made. I choose freedom, whatever the cost." He reached up with hands that were already beginning to show the texture of living flesh, and grasped the ring that had enslaved him so long. The metal burned his fingers, but he did not flinch or cry out. Instead, he began to sing, not the song of making, but something older and more personal. It was the coronation hymn of Angmar, the melody that had played when he first took the crown of kingship. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The ring shattered in his grasp, its fragments falling like golden tears to the stone floor. The explosion of released power shook Mount Doom to its foundations and sent tremors racing through all of Mordor. In Barad-dûr, Sauron cried out in shock and rage as he felt his greatest servant slip free from his control. But the working was not yet complete, for the breaking of the Witch King's ring had created a cascade effect that raced along the bonds connecting all the 9. In distant parts of Middle-earth, the remaining 5 Nazgûl suddenly found their own chains growing loose, their own wills awakening for the first time in millennia. "Now!" Morwen cried, raising her voice in the final verse of the Song of Making. "While the bonds are weakened, we can free them all." What followed was the greatest working of the Third Age, a symphony of liberation that echoed across the entire world. The 3 singers poured all their power into the music, calling to each of the remaining Nazgûl by name and offering them the same choice that their leader had made. The song reached across vast distances, touching hearts that had been frozen for centuries and kindling hope where none had existed. One by one, the remaining 5 chose freedom. In the fortress of Dol Guldur, Adunafel the Quiet cast off her ring and remembered the beauty she had once loved. In the wastes of Rhûn, Hormarath of Dyr broke his chains and recalled the honor he had once upheld. 3 more followed suit, each choosing mortality over servitude, each adding their voice to the growing chorus of liberation. The song reached its climax as all 9 rings shattered simultaneously, their destruction sending a shock wave of released power racing across Middle-earth. In every corner of the world, people looked up in wonder as the very air seemed to sing with joy. The reign of the Nazgûl was ended, and with it, one of Sauron's greatest weapons had been turned into his greatest weakness. In the chambers of fire, the former Witch King stood revealed at last, no longer the terrible wraith-like figure that had haunted the nightmares of men, but a warrior king in the prime of his life, his dark hair touched with silver and his eyes bright with the light of freedom. He was tall and noble, every inch the monarch he had once been, and when he smiled, it was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. "I am King Eärnur no more," he said, choosing to reclaim his true name for the first time in 3,000 years. "Nor am I the Witch King of Angmar. I am Tarmeron of Númenor, and I choose to stand once more with the free peoples of Middle-earth." But their triumph was short-lived, for the destruction of the 9 had not gone unnoticed. The ground beneath their feet began to shake, as Sauron's rage manifested in physical form, and they could hear the sound of marching feet echoing through the tunnels that led to the surface. "We must flee," Khamûl urged. "The Dark Lord will not suffer us to escape after what we have done." Yet even as they prepared to run, Tarmairon raised a hand for silence. "No," he said with quiet authority. "We do not flee. We have struck the first blow in the final battle. Now we must strike the last." He pointed toward the peak of Mount Doom, where the fires of the earth burned brightest. "There lies the source of his power," he said. "The One Ring may be destroyed, but Sauron himself remains, and while he endures, Middle-earth will never know true peace." Morwen felt her heart race with the audacity of what he proposed. To challenge the Dark Lord in his own stronghold, weakened though he might be, seemed like madness beyond measure. Yet as she looked around the circle at the faces of her companions, Khamûl, the redeemed, Tarostar the proud, and Tarmeron the free, she saw only determination. "Then we finish what we started," she said simply. "We end this, once and for all." The final battle was fought not with armies or weapons, but with will and song and the unbreakable power of love triumphant over hate. As Sauron descended from his tower in physical form for the first time since the last alliance, he found himself facing not cowering enemies, but proud rebels who sang of freedom and choice. The Song of Making rose once more in the heart of Mordor, but this time it was joined by voices from across Middle-earth. Every freed Nazgûl adding their power to the working, every free person lifting their voice in defiance of tyranny. In the end, it was not violence that defeated the Dark Lord, but the simple truth that love freely given is stronger than any power won by force. Sauron's own corruption turned against him as the song revealed the emptiness at the heart of his dominion, and he crumbled to dust beneath the weight of his own malice. When the music finally faded and the echoes died away, Middle-earth was free at last. The long darkness was ended, and a new age of peace and wonder had begun. In the years that followed, tales would be told of the Maid of Dol Amroth, who kissed a Nazgûl and changed the fate of the world. But those who knew the truth understood that it was not a single kiss that worked the miracle, but the power of love to see beyond darkness to the light that dwells in every heart. And in the gardens of Minas Tirith, where Morwen and Camel made their home in the years of peace that followed, white roses bloomed eternal in memory of a queen named Miriel, whose love had endured beyond death itself. Thus ends the tale of she who kissed a Nazgûl, as recorded in the Red Book of Westmarch, and sung by minstrels in the halls of King. May it serve as a reminder that even the darkest night must yield to dawn, and that love, freely given, can overcome any shadow.